Upstate New York, November 1957. In the sleepy town of Appalachian, an extraordinary meeting was taking place. Gathered in the garden of one of the town's wealthiest residents, a gang of sharp-dressed businessmen feasted on several hundred pounds of steak. This unusual group attracted attention, and the local cops looked on astonished. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing a summit meeting of the entire leadership of the American Mafia. In fact, until that moment, many denied the Mafia even existed. Sure, there was crime, but organized crime, a criminal gang with secret initiation rites and codes enforced by sentence of death, seemed like something out of the movies. Across the Atlantic in Sicily, things were much the same. Here, in the birthplace of the Mafia, its influence reached into every corner of life. Yet its very existence was often denied. Secrecy and internal discipline gave the Mafia its power, and this power was about to go global. 1957 marked the moment the American and Sicilian Mafias became international, forming a billion-dollar crime corporation. It was a turning point in another way, too. It signaled the start of a war against organized crime that would last almost half a century. A war that forced both the US and Italy, finally, to confront the terrifying criminal conspiracy in their midst. United States in the mid-1950s. The good times were here. The country had emerged from depression and World War with a booming economy. For many ordinary men and women, the American dream had become a reality. But something else was booming too: the Mafia. For those growing up in a family associated with the mob, it was as if the outside world barely existed, apart from being a source of easy money. The Mafia is organized in groups called families. The head of the family is known as the boss, or the godfather. And the longest-serving New York boss of all time was Joe Bonanno, known as Joe Bananas. He ran the Bonanno family from the early 1930s until the mid-1960s. Bonanno's power was founded on the influence he wielded over his community in New York. His son, Bill, saw firsthand how his father operated, and himself became a leading gangster with the Bonanno family.
My father would, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, would go into this hall and sit in an office in the back, and various people from the neighborhood would come in and ask favors. Somebody had a sick child, and she couldn't pay the doctor, and my father would arrange for that. Somebody else had a husband who was cheating on her, and she wanted to know what to do. He would take care of that. That happened twice a week. So when that happens, you begin to form the ideas that when you have a problem, you know where to go.
This is home movie footage, shot in Brooklyn in 1957. It looks like any ordinary American family, enjoying the new prosperity. But looks can be deceiving. Dominic Montilio was born into a mob family in New York. Some of his relatives were senior mobsters in the Gambino crime family, another of America's leading mafia families. Montilio was aware from an early age how his relatives were unlike others in the neighborhood.
I grew up in a very traditional mob family, and it was a very different kind of life than my other friends had. You know, I noticed that from the beginning, because there was times when Well, the FBI would break down the door because, I mean, we lived in the same house with my uncle, and he was very connected.
Montiglio's uncle was an up-and-coming gangster called Nino Gaggi. One day when he was 11, Dominic ran home, bursting to tell his uncle Nino that he had been elected class president at school.
I came home all excited because I had the button, you know, it said president on it. And he said, oh, great. He says, what does the class president do? So I said, you know, teacher goes out of the room and you watch the class. If anybody does anything wrong, you write their name on the board. And he looked at me and he says, you're telling me you're a rat. You're a stool pigeon. So I said, you know, I mean, 10 years old, 11 years old, what are you going to say? And he said, well, tomorrow you got to go back and give that button back to the teacher and tell her you can't be the class president.
Il Bonanno and Dominic Montiglio both grew up in a world closed to the outside. The American mafia called itself Cosa Nostra, our thing. But this was a world imported to America from several thousand miles away. This is where the mafia came from. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, with a population of 5 million, less than 2 miles from the Italian mainland. Like Montiglio, Leo Luca Orlando was born in 1947, in Palermo, Sicily's biggest city. Unlike Montiglio, he would grow up to fight the mafia, not join it.
Sicily is a land of contradictions. Palermo is the capital of Sicily, is the capital of the mafia too. Is the capital of the history, is the capital of the shame of this land.
In the Sicilian dialect, mafioso once meant bold or beautiful. From the 1860s, it became the name associated with the island's criminal element, who were often organized into families of men related by blood or marriage. But their existence was steeped in secrecy. Even discussing the mafia was taboo, as Orlando found one day at school.
When I was 14 years old, 15 years old, I organized with other students a seminar about the mafia and against the mafia. The director, the Jesuit director of the school, called my parents and said, it is a scandal. Why Lucchetto is speaking about the mafia? We have nothing to do with the mafia, therefore we are not to speak about the mafia. Gray area, not seeing, not speaking, not hearing. It was Sicily when I was a young student.
Joe Bonanno grew up in this world. He was a native Sicilian, born here in the pretty seaside town of Castellammare del Golfo in 1905. He only moved to America in the 1920s.
Sicily has a long history of mistrust of authority. There's an old saying back there that to know a man, you have to know his father, and his father before him, and his father before him. And once that happens, there is very little room for betrayal.
Much of the power of the mafia derived from its ruthless discipline. Chief among these values was omertà, the vow of silence. In Sicily, all mafiosi had to take a sacred blood oath that they would never betray the organization to the authorities, and that they would always carry out the orders of their mob bosses. The novice was sworn in through a quasi-religious ceremony and became a so-called man of honor. The American mafia followed exactly the same traditional initiation ceremony.
You're brought into a room and you're given the image of a saint. Prick your finger, enough to draw a drop or two of blood, put it on the image of the saint, put the saint in your hand, and they light it. And you take an oath, and it simply says that you hope to burn as this saint is burning if you betray your brothers.
To break this oath would mean death.
Our culture taught us to act like men. And acting like men meant keeping your mouth shut.
But for Bonanno and his fellow gangsters, omertà was more than just a vow of silence.
Omertà comes from the root manly, and it simply means to act like a man. And a man doesn't get somebody else into trouble. Therefore, he doesn't say, John did it. Who hit you in the face? John hit me in the face. A man will see to it that John gets hit in the face.
Just exactly what that meant is made clear by Dominic Montiglio. For his uncle Nino Gaggi, like other mafiosi of his generation, Sicilian traditions ran deep. His world was dominated by loyalty, secrecy, and vengeance. True to his roots, when Gaggi had his nose broken in a fight, he was determined to get his revenge, even if that meant waiting years. When the moment finally arrived, Gaggi took Montiglio and mobster Roy DeMeo with him to settle the score.
We parked a long block away from where this guy was, and he was hanging out with a bunch of people in front of a candy store, and we were waiting across the street, and I had a 22 with a silencer, and Nino and Roy both had 38s, and we waited for him to go to his car, and he was walking to his car. We started crossing the street, and then he made us, and he started to run, and we hit him right in the middle of the intersection.
Killings like this were a way of life in the Gambino crime family.
Oddly enough, it was my wife's birthday party. So we had left the party to go do this deed, and went back to her birthday party like nothing happened. You know, we opened the presents, had the cake, and that was the end of that.
Nino Gaggi was an old-fashioned gangster, a man to whom the traditional Sicilian values of the mafia meant everything.
You know, somebody were to break my nose, I might wait a little while, but my revenge would be maybe a broken nose and a little something else, a couple of fingers or something. But Nino, the old Sicilian school, you know, that's not good enough for them. You know, they have to make it 100-fold worse than what happened to them for them to be satisfied.
The values imported by Sicilian mafiosi to the United States were violent, secretive, and mistrustful of outsiders. In America, gangsters would take these traditional values and add go-getting entrepreneurial spirit to create a whole new kind of criminal organization. Early in the 20th century, a young man was growing up in Sicily who would change the face of crime. Salvatore Lucania, born in 1897, would become infamous as Charlie Lucky Luciano, the father of the modern American mafia. His hometown of La Cara Fridi was built on the hard and dangerous work of sulfur mining. Sulfur mines were primitive places where temperatures were so high, men would work naked. Yet these deprived laborers still had to pay the mafia for the right to work. They were not alone. The owner of the mine would have paid up too. The mafia squeezed money from all walks of Sicilian life. When he was 10, Luciano was one of hundreds of thousands of Sicilians who left the poverty of the islands behind and set sail for a new life in America. He soon drifted into crime. As a teenager, Luciano joined the notorious 5 Points gang, which also boasted Al Capone as a member. It was the age of prohibition. For 13 years, it was illegal to make or sell alcohol in the United States. Luciano and other bootleggers made millions supplying Americans with as much booze as they wanted. Salvatore Lucania started calling himself Charles Luciano. He gained the nickname Lucky and the scars on his neck when he miraculously survived a knife attack and beating. He presided over his criminal kingdom from a suite in New York's luxurious Waldorf Hotel. Here, he called himself Mr. Charles Ross. And he made it to the very top in 1932 with the killing of Salvatore Maranzano, then the most powerful boss in America. But the constant battles were getting in the way of business.
If there were 3 Italian mobsters in the Italian neighborhood, it was an almost certain guarantee that at least 2 of them were going to try to kill the 3rd. And the 3rd was plotting against the other 2. So bodies would wind up in the streets. To what purpose?
Luciano wanted the mafia families to bury their differences, not each other.
We can't make money with guns in our hand, was his expression, the expression that I heard over and over again. We can't make money with guns in our hand.
His solution was to set up a body called a commission, a mafia board of directors made up of the bosses of the 5 New York families, plus those of Chicago and Buffalo. Any boss with a grievance against another family could bring it to the commission. But for the plan to succeed, Luciano had to win the support of the other families, including Joe Bonanno, who had just taken over for Maranzano, the man whose killing Luciano had set up.
Because you got to remember, Luciano was an Americanized guy, so he talked that way. My dad always told me that Luciano talked just like those Americans. And he says, those guys are dead. I have no quarrel with you, and I know you don't have a quarrel with me. Therefore, past is the past, let's go on.
Joe Bonanno backed Luciano's plan and joined him on the first commission alongside Al Capone.
Luciano's conception was that he would meld Sicilian mafia mores, which formed a very tight organization, with American business methods. That's basically what he came up with. A kind of amalgam that we came to know as American mafia organized crime.
With peace, the mob could concentrate on what it knew best, making millions of dollars from its control of illegal gambling, prostitution, and extortion. Small wonder life as a mobster seemed so attractive to many growing up in post-war America. The teenage Henry Hill watched awestruck from the window of his Brooklyn home at mafiosi gathered on the street.
You know, you see those Cadillacs and, you know, and guys in suits, big black suits and diamond rings like the size of a quarter, you know, and beautiful woman. What the f is this, you know? So I walked over, got a job, washing cars, sweeping them out, you know, just to hang out there. And that's how I, you know, started hanging out over there. And it was exciting, you know?
Hill would become a mobster with the Lucchese family. Another future gangster, Frank Culotta, was also in awe of the mobsters he saw as he was growing up in Chicago.
Well, actually, I grew up into that world. The neighborhood I came from, they were all outfit guys, crooks, murderers. And I sort of looked up to them and idolized them. I used to shine their shoes. They'd give me, instead of a nickel, they'd give me $1. So, I seen a lot of money then as a kid, and they impressed me. So in my mind, I always wanted to be something like that.
The ruthless discipline the commission brought to the world of crime meant the power of the mob grew unchecked. In New York, places like the waterfront became synonymous with mafia control. It used its control of the unions and fishing companies to make millions a year. It did the same across the city in industries such as construction, in which the Bonanno family was involved.
You construct a building, and you'd put in even just a 2 or 3 cent increase on the value of the cement that was used in that building, which could turn into millions of dollars.
every yard of concrete that got poured in the city, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, everybody got a piece of that yard of concrete, just through the unions.
It wasn't just one little thing, but you multiply this by hundreds and hundreds and thousands of activities that were going on throughout the country, and you got a force to be reckoned with.
In New York, the mafia seemed to have its finger in every pie.
We ran the city, basically. I mean, we could stop a building from going up, or a movie being made, a show on Broadway. You know, I mean, you didn't do it right. You didn't do what the boss wanted you to do. You were either dead or you were out of business. It wasn't pretty.
For the most part, the authorities denied the existence of a national criminal organization. One reason was that the mafia was busy buying protection for itself. Bill Bonanno says he would meet corrupt police officers in a restaurant to give them their bribes.
I had dinner at a little restaurant, and I was there with two other friends. And we were sitting around, and they said, "You have a look of nostalgia in your face. What's up?" I said, "You know, I used to come here in the late 40s and the early 50s, and I turned around and I said, I used to sit in that corner back there, and I used to meet with a captain and two lieutenants from law enforcement. And one of them said, well, what were you doing here? I said, we were giving them their envelopes. Envelopes for what? To look the other way while we had the gambling, we had the horse racing, the bookmaking, and the numbers."
The commission was presiding over a boom time. As he rose through the ranks of the mob, Bill Bonanno attended several meetings of the commission with his father, mafia boss Joe Bonanno. The commission boasted it was so powerful that it could even influence government.
I can remember a time, and I participated in some of those meetings, and the decisions that had to be made were, you're going to be the next federal judge. You're going to be the next governor. You're going to be the next senator. You're going to be the next House of Representatives candidate. The men got up after those decisions, and lo and behold, it happened.
The mafia had a power that was unacknowledged and unchallenged, until the temptation to make even more money proved impossible to resist, and finally forced the US government to act. In the United States and Italy in the 1950s, the mafia controlled many aspects of life. Yet the governments in both countries barely acknowledged the existence of organized crime. Law enforcement had a different enemy. The Cold War was at its height. The main target of the FBI were American communists, not Italian-American gangsters.
The communist bloc has woven a vast network of espionage throughout the free world.
Communist line is uniform and deadly. Destroy America.
After World War II, in the FBI's New York office, there were 400 agents chasing communists. There were just 5 dealing with organized crime. The story was similar at the Department of Justice, where William Hundley worked.
When I took over the organized crime section in the Justice Department in 87, there were basically, maybe 7 or 8 lawyers there who were basically clipping newspapers. They weren't doing anything either.
The director of the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover. He had been its head for over 30 years. Hoover was one of the most powerful men in Washington, eventually serving under 8 presidents. In law enforcement, what Hoover said went. And to Hoover, America's priority was the Red Menace. Hoover had almost no Italian-American agents who could infiltrate the mob. Indeed, he had few agents from any ethnic minority.
At that time, Hoover did not have one black agent. He had no female agents. Excuse me, his chauffeur was black, so he made his chauffeur an agent, so he could say he had one black agent. In essence, he had all of these waspy guys, you know, with the snap hats on and whatnot. Yeah.
But from the late 1950s, a succession of events would change all that, finally forcing the authorities and the nation to acknowledge the existence of the mafia. Once again, it all started in Sicily. And it was a story in which mafia godfather Joe Bonanno played a central role. In late 1957, Bonanno took a trip back to his native Sicily. He had been born here in the tiny coastal town of Castellammare del Golfo before emigrating to the US as a youngster. But Bonanno's trip was no sentimental journey. The Mafia Don was on business. Joe Bonanno had maintained close links with his family and criminal associates in the old country. He was approached by some old acquaintances for advice on a pressing problem.
My dad told me that one of the leaders of the Palermo Mafia came to him and said that there's a few people that they would like to talk to him about certain problems that they're having here in Sicily.
A meeting took place in this building, the Grand Hotel des Palmes in Palermo, one of the top hotels in the Sicilian capital. Even to this day, details of who attended and what was discussed remain shrouded in mystery. Bonanno may not have been the only American present. Charles Lucky Luciano was now living in Italy, having been deported from the US after the war. Today, the Italian authorities believe that he was also present at the Hotel des Palmes.
E dal 12 al 16 ottobre del 57 a Palermo.
From the 10th to the 16th of October 1957 in Palermo, in the Hotel des Palmes, there was a summit of about 30 mafia bosses. American Cosa Nostra and Sicilian mafia bosses.
Famiglie americane, cioè era presente per esempio la famiglia Bonanno con il suo capo Joe Bonanno, con altri membri.
The major American families were represented: Joe Bonanno, Lucky Luciano, who had been in Italy since 1947, and then there were the local mafia heads.
Era presente Lucky Luciano, che era già in Italia dal 47, e poi erano presenti i capimafia locali, i capimafia siciliani.
Over dinner, the Sicilians explained why they wanted the meeting. This was a business convention, and high on the agenda was the subject of drugs, which offered vast profit, but at a price.
The purpose of the meeting was to pick my father's brains as to how they were going to resolve a problem they were beginning to have among each other over the narcotics trade in Turkey.
The Sicilians faced a dilemma.
Various families within the mafia were at odds as to whether they should or they shouldn't get themselves involved with this, and the younger element saw nothing wrong in making a profit.
In fact, the American mafia was having the same debate about drugs. It seems that Joe Bonanno wasn't just offering friendly advice. He was there to close a deal that would reorganize the global trade in heroin. According to the FBI, it was this meeting which established the Bonanno family as the main players in the transatlantic heroin trade. The Sicilians would manufacture and smuggle the drug into the US. The Americans would distribute it and take a cut. This was the first time the mafias on both sides of the Atlantic had come together on such a scale. An early example of globalization, but run by organized crime.
Di Sicilian Connection non si parla in epoca più tardi.
The foundations were laid for collaboration between Sicilian mafia, which wasn't yet called Cosa Nostra, and the American Cosa Nostra, which had as its main objective heroin trafficking.
Bill Bonanno says the organization of the mafia itself was also on the agenda, and that his father advised the Sicilians to copy Luciano's recipe for resolving disputes.
It was at that meeting that he suggested that one of the ways that they might resolve their problem and have a little better handle on the situation is to do what the Americans had done, and that was to form a commission.
The Sicilians did set up a commission, but it would only meet a few times and never gained the authority of the American original. In America, the subject of drugs continued to dominate mafia discussions.
The new organization that Luciano created solved just about every problem you could think of, except one: narcotics. In the beginning, Luciano assumed that the organization could keep organized crime out of narcotics altogether. It simply wasn't worth the trouble. The difficulty was the money.
And for the mafia, money was always irresistible. The Americans arranged a summit to ratify the deal with their Sicilian cousins, a meeting that would provide one of the most infamous moments of their history. The deal between the Sicilian and American mafia in late 1957 was a turning point for both organizations. The money offered by the drug business was the key. Everyone knew that drug dealing was a far bigger dollar earner than other activities like illegal gambling and extortion. But it also brought with it long prison sentences, and mob bosses feared that their men would break the code of silence if they faced decades in prison.
There was friction among the various families. Some of the younger people, especially those in New York and in Boston and in Chicago, thought that this was the great new thing coming. Speaking strictly about money.
The mafia in Chicago, known as the Outfit, claimed the hardest anti-drugs line. Frank Carlotta was a rising young gangster there.
At the time I was there was no drugs allowed to be sold, or you couldn't deal with drugs at all, or else you get whacked. Because we always knew that if you dealt with drugs, it was a dirty business, and it'd be like you're feeding your own kid narcotics. So it was like taboo, and if you got involved with it, you're definitely going to get whacked.
The mafia families called a summit in November 1957, just 1 month after the meeting with the Sicilians in Palermo. Joe Bonanno was to be joined at the summit by another godfather, Vito Genovese. Both men wanted the mob to deal in drugs.
Chief among Genovese's agenda items was narcotics. He was directly involved in narcotics. Bonanno was deeply involved in narcotics. A lot of the other bosses were on the sly involved in narcotics. And he argued, look, it's a fact of life anyway. Who are we kidding? Let's make it official. Let's really make money out of this thing.
The summit was held in a small town called Appalachian in upstate New York. The venue was a large house on a 58-acre estate owned by Joseph Barbera, a wealthy businessman and mafia associate. It was chosen because its isolated rural location seemed safe from the prying eyes of the law. Unfortunately for the mob bosses, they got that 100% wrong. For over a year, the local state police had been watching the place after they discovered that a house guest was a leading New York mobster, Carmine Galante, Joe Bonanno's underboss. On the 14th of November, officers were surprised to observe several Cadillacs with out-of-state plates. When the state troopers went to take a closer look, they saw about 100 men enjoying a barbecue, all of them wearing dark suits, fedoras, and shiny shoes.
If you didn't know that it was a mafia summit, and you suddenly were dropped from a spaceship into the middle of this thing, you would think it's just some kind of friendly barbecue among a lot of friends who, oddly enough, seem to be wearing suits to a barbecue, but you know, each to his own taste.
Suddenly, someone spotted the police.
These are men that if you, like Pavlov's dogs, if you say, it's the cops, there's one instinct. That's to run. That's exactly what they did.
Pandemonium broke out. Some bosses hid, some took to their cars, others fled into the woods.
It was a farce. It was probably the mafia's lowest moment. The idea of all these big-time bosses running through the thickets in their sharkskin suits and their silk ties and their $500 Italian shoes. It was unbelievable.
Joe Bonanno escaped the chaos, but only because he was late.
They were coming there. When they got to the bottom of the hill, you could see all the way up the hill, and they could see these police cars and the barricades in front of the street. So they just kept on driving and went back to New York City.
Around 60 mobsters were detained, identified, and questioned. But there was little the authorities could do. Attending a barbecue was not a crime, and they were not even carrying guns. While the mobsters went free, they were convicted by the media. The next day, the Gangland Conference was headline news across America. Appalachian had finally provided proof of the existence and scale of the mafia.
J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI, said there is no such thing as the mafia. There is no such thing as the National Crime Organization. There is no such thing as a leadership group within this organization. Well, even he had to admit after this meeting that maybe there was something.
The extent of organized crime in the United States is a national disgrace. The very fact that we have a crime problem reflects an evil of even greater import.
It generated a lot of pressure to get something done. In my own situation, I mean, that's why I was appointed head of the organized crime section.
Now law enforcement would have to play catch-up to come to terms with organized crime.
One of my biggest complaints was that, we wanted to pool information on these people. We wanted the investigative agencies to share it. We wanted to collect it on the mafia leaders and whatnot to make our efforts to prosecute them much more feasible. Couldn't get it done. They just wouldn't do it. First of all, they didn't have anything, and second of all, they wouldn't share what they didn't have,
The spotlight was now on the mafia. Before long, they would attract the attention of the president and the American public alike. In 1960, the United States went to the polls to choose a new president. It was the most hotly contested election for years. John Kennedy and his rival Richard Nixon were neck and neck in the polls. The contest was too close to call. Both candidates made every effort to get the voters out.
We are aiming our whole campaign toward the unregistered voter, to try to get those citizens who are not registered to vote, who are not even eligible to vote in this election, to get them on the books so that they can vote in November. This is a crucial area as far as Senator Kennedy is concerned.
The American mafia had influenced local politics for decades. Now seasoned gangsters suddenly got community spirit on a national stage. Chicago gangster Frank Alotta says he was told by his boss to get involved in the election.
Came around and told all us guys to reach out to all the Italian people and Polish people that they had this Irishman, Kennedy, that was running against Nixon, and we needed to get him in office. We needed all the votes we could get to get this guy in office.
It seemed the mafia wanted Kennedy in the Oval Office. What has never been clear is why, despite allegations of links between JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, and organized crime. Kennedy squeaked by, beating Nixon by just over 100,000 votes across the country. In Illinois, the Democrats won by just 9,000 votes.
The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s.
If the mafia hoped that a Kennedy administration would be easy on organized crime, the new president turned out to be a major disappointment. His younger brother Robert became Attorney General. He had already proved to be a ferocious opponent of organized crime, from his time as counsel to the Senate Labor Rackets Committee. His appointment had an immediate impact on the FBI and its director, J. Edgar Hoover.
That's when Hoover started having his agents put in the bugs, the listening devices and whatnot, because he knew that Kennedy was going to press him very hard on organized crime.
The FBI bugged two main centers of mob activity in the US, Chicago and Las Vegas, where the lucrative gambling rackets were run by the Chicago mob, known as the Outfit. It was illegal to listen to private conversations, even those of suspected gangsters, but it went a long way to convincing many in the agency that the mob posed a very real threat.
These devices, of course, were illegal because they involved breaking and entering and whatnot. But the information that the FBI picked up on those devices, they might not have convinced Hoover, but they certainly convinced the FBI as an institution that there was a mafia.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or mafia.
This was not what the mob had expected. Some mafiosi claimed that a deal had been made and broken.
I was amazed that Robert Kennedy went after organized crime so hard, because it went against everything that Robert Kennedy's father had agreed to for the help and support of getting Jack elected to the presidency.
The American government was taking a more aggressive line, but they had failed to penetrate the mob. Part of the mafia's power was based on its code of silence, known as omertà. Then the FBI got a break. It was a story that had its roots in the mafia's continuing indecision as to whether to get involved in the heroin trade. Joe Valachi was a mobster with the Genovese crime family, a 30-year veteran of organized crime.
Valachi had a sixth grade education. I think he committed his first crime when he was about 6 or 7 years old. Broke into a grocery store, in and out of jail. But he had, he had street smarts.
Joe Valachi was a low-scale, knuckle-dragging hood who was never going to be any more than a soldier. He was never going to make the really big money.
In 1962, he was in Atlanta jail serving a prison sentence for drug dealing. He feared that his bosses were going to kill him there, for officially, the mob was still opposed to drugs. Valachi acted first, murdering an inmate he believed had been ordered to kill him. It was the wrong man. Whether through fear or remorse, Valachi broke and decided to turn government witness.
Now, the original idea was that he would become an informant for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and tell them about other dope dealers. That's all the Bureau wanted to know. Other dope dealers, that's their job. But Robert Kennedy had a brighter idea. He said, wait a minute, let's talk to him about the mafia.
It was the first crack in the mafia's code of silence. William Hungley was one of the first to hear his revelations.
As soon as we got the story, I mean, we moved him up to Fort Dix, flew him up there in a helicopter. The brig up there was empty, and we put him in the brig. We started interviewing him.
Valachi detailed the structure of the mafia families, from his level as a soldier to the very top, the Godfathers. But this information was never given by him in any criminal trials. Instead, Robert Kennedy turned to television, which was covering the sessions of the McClellan Committee.
Bobby Kennedy had the brilliant idea, let's put Joe Valachi on show. Joe Valachi gets before the Senate Committee, and a national audience is absolutely fascinated.
The nation's underworld gets the unwelcome spotlight of publicity as the Senate's Investigations Subcommittee begins new hearings on crime. Arkansas Senator McClellan is at the helm.
William Hungley was present as Valachi's electrifying testimony was broadcast across the nation.
He really didn't want to cooperate. There's no doubt about that. Quite frankly, though, when he got in front of those Klieg lights up before the McClellan Committee, he, you know, the adrenaline started to flow, and I think he, you know, sort of a perverse way that he kind of enjoyed it.
Why did you decide to kill him at that time, at that spot?
Because he's the guy I spotted at that time. In other words, I felt that was my last day, in plain English, Senator. I felt that was my last day.
In other words, this was a defense for you. You thought that if you killed this man who you thought was going to kill you anyway, that this...
I got some satisfaction, Senator. Put it
You
that
got some
way.
satisfaction.
Valachi's testimony caused a sensation. Here, live on TV, was a mobster giving the first tantalizing glimpse into the secret world of the mafia, or, as he called it, Cosa Nostra, Italian for our thing. Valachi corroborated what the FBI bugs had begun to pick up, and what its director, J. Edgar Hoover, had reluctantly started to believe. That a modern American criminal group used rituals and symbols from Sicily to maintain internal discipline and run its multi-million-dollar enterprise.
While you were repeating the words, you were burning the paper.
Right, this is the way I burn if I expose this organization.
There's always a lot of skepticism about that, you know, that, I mean, because nobody had ever come forward and, you know, said how you get made and whatnot. And apparently, you know, it was exactly the way he said it was. You know, they decide who's going to get made, you get together, you burn this holy picture and whatnot, and then bingo, you're a made member of the mafia.
He went on to explain that you lived by the gun and by the knife, and you died by the gun and by the knife.
Who was chosen? Who became your godfather?
Joe Bonanno.
Joe Bonanno?
It happened to be
now,
my
where
godfather.
is he? Is he on this chart we have here? Is he at the head of one of the families now?
Yeah, he still is.
He still is?
Yes.
Still alive?
Right.
For the American mafia, and the Bonanno family in particular, Valachi's TV appearances were devastating.
Valachi's testimony was certainly a blow to the people in our world. There's no question about that.
Senator, can I say something, Senator?
Yeah.
As to what I'm telling you now, I need to go no further to say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom.
Joe Valachi died in prison of cancer in 1971. He had helped shatter the view that there was no national criminal organization in the United States. Cosa Nostra could no longer act in secret at a time when they were moving more and more onto the international stage with their Sicilian cousins. For both mafias, once broken, omertà, the vow of silence, could never be as strong again. Upstate New York, November 1957. In the sleepy town of Appalachian, an extraordinary meeting was taking place. Gathered in the garden of one of the town's wealthiest residents, a gang of sharp-dressed businessmen feasted on several hundred pounds of steak. This unusual group attracted attention, and the local cops looked on astonished. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing a summit meeting of the entire leadership of the American Mafia. In fact, until that moment, many denied the Mafia even existed. Sure, there was crime, but organized crime, a criminal gang with secret initiation rites and codes enforced by sentence of death, seemed like something out of the movies. Across the Atlantic in Sicily, things were much the same. Here, in the birthplace of the Mafia, its influence reached into every corner of life. Yet its very existence was often denied. Secrecy and internal discipline gave the Mafia its power, and this power was about to go global. 1957 marked the moment the American and Sicilian Mafias became international, forming a billion-dollar crime corporation. It was a turning point in another way, too. It signaled the start of a war against organized crime that would last almost half a century. A war that forced both the US and Italy, finally, to confront the terrifying criminal conspiracy in their midst. United States in the mid-1950s. The good times were here. The country had emerged from depression and World War with a booming economy. For many ordinary men and women, the American dream had become a reality. But something else was booming too: the Mafia. For those growing up in a family associated with the mob, it was as if the outside world barely existed, apart from being a source of easy money. The Mafia is organized in groups called families. The head of the family is known as the boss, or the godfather. And the longest-serving New York boss of all time was Joe Bonanno, known as Joe Bananas. He ran the Bonanno family from the early 1930s until the mid-1960s. Bonanno's power was founded on the influence he wielded over his community in New York. His son Bill saw firsthand how his father operated, and himself became a leading gangster with the Bonanno family.
My father would, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, would go into this hall and sit in an office in the back, and various people from the neighborhood would come in and ask favors. Somebody had a sick child, and she couldn't pay the doctor, and my father would arrange for that. Somebody else had a husband who was cheating on her, and she wanted to know what to do. He would take care of that. That happened twice a week. So when that happens, you begin to form the ideas that when you have a problem, you know where to go.
This is home movie footage, shot in Brooklyn in 1957. It looks like any ordinary American family, enjoying the new prosperity. But looks can be deceiving. Dominic Montilio was born into a mob family in New York. Some of his relatives were senior mobsters in the Gambino crime family, another of America's leading mafia families. Montiglio was aware from an early age how his relatives were unlike others in the neighborhood.
I grew up in a very traditional mob family, and it was a very different kind of life than my other friends had. You know, I noticed that from the beginning, because there was times when, well, the FBI would break down the door because, I mean, we lived in the same house with my uncle, and he was very connected.
Montiglio's uncle was an up-and-coming gangster called Nino Gaggi. One day when he was 11, Dominic ran home, bursting to tell his uncle Nino that he had been elected class president at school.
I came home all excited because I had the button, you know, it said president on it. And he said, oh, great. He says, what does the class president do? So I said, you know, teacher goes out of the room and you watch the class. If anybody does anything wrong, you write their name on the board. And he looked at me and he says, you're telling me you're a rat, you're a stool pigeon. So I said, you know, I mean, 10 years old, 11 years old, what are you going to say? And he said, well, tomorrow you got to go back and give that button back to the teacher and tell her you can't be the class president.
Bill Bonanno and Dominic Montiglio both grew up in a world closed to the outside. The American Mafia called itself Cosa Nostra, our thing. But this was a world imported to America from several thousand miles away. This is where the Mafia came from. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, with a population of 5 million, less than 2 miles from the Italian mainland. Like Montiglio, Leo Luca Orlando was born in 1947, in Palermo, Sicily's biggest city. Unlike Montiglio, he would grow up to fight the Mafia, not join it.
Sicily is a land of contradictions. Palermo is the capital of Sicily, is the capital of the Mafia too. Is the capital of the history, is the capital of the shame of this land.
In the Sicilian dialect, mafioso once meant bold or beautiful. From the 1860s, it became the name associated with the island's criminal element, who were often organized into families of men related by blood or marriage. But their existence was steeped in secrecy. Even discussing the Mafia was taboo, as Orlando found one day at school.
When I was 14 years old, 15 years old, I organized with other students a seminar about the Mafia and against the Mafia. The director, the Jesuit director of the school, called my parents and said, it is a scandal. Why Lucchetto is speaking about the Mafia? We have nothing to do with the Mafia, therefore we are not speaking about the Mafia. Gray area, not seeing, not speaking, not hearing. It was Sicily when I was a young student.
Joe Bonanno grew up in this world. He was a native Sicilian, born here in the pretty seaside town of Castellammare del Golfo in 1905. He only moved to America in the 1920s.
Sicily has a long history of mistrust of authority. There's an old saying back there that to know a man, you have to know his father, and his father before him, and his father before him. And once that happens, there is very little room for betrayal.
Much of the power of the Mafia derived from its ruthless discipline. Chief among these values was omertà, the vow of silence. In Sicily, all mafiosi had to take a sacred blood oath that they would never betray the organization to the authorities, and that they would always carry out the orders of their mob bosses. The novice was sworn in through a quasi-religious ceremony and became a so-called man of honor. The American Mafia followed exactly the same traditional initiation ceremony.
You're brought into a room and you're given the image of a saint. Prick your finger, enough to draw a drop or two of blood, put it on the image of the saint, put the saint in your hand, and they light it. And you take an oath, and it simply says that you hope to burn as this saint.
Sammy the Bull Gravano was the mob's perfect killer. No questions, no mistakes, no guilt.
Here's a man that went to bed with a woman every night of his married life, knowing that he murdered her brother.
He said he felt like he could feel the bullet leaving the gun. To take a man's life didn't repel him.
He built a construction empire in New York City and became underboss to John Gotti, the infamous Dapper Don.
Sammy Gravano was the power behind the throne.
When the feds closed in, Gravano made a decision that would put his boss behind bars for life and decimate New York's most powerful crime family.
As a member of our family's administration, I helped John Gotti run the family. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Salvatore Gravano. Early in my life, I was given the nickname Sammy the Bull.
In a working-class neighborhood of Brooklyn called Bensonhurst, people would whisper about the mafia, about men who were connected. Sammy Gravano, the highest-ranking mobster ever to testify against his boss, was born here on March 12, 1945. Young Sammy grew up in this house with his parents and two older sisters. He kept pictures of James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart on the walls of his room. His parents were Sicilian immigrants who ran a small dress factory. On their way to Sunday Mass, Sammy and his father would pass a corner saloon where gangsters congregated.
He noticed his father always walked on the other side of the street. And Sammy, he kept saying, "Who are these people? Who are those men, Dad?" And finally, his father said, "Well, they're bad people, but they're our bad people."
It was these men who gave Sammy his nickname. He had just turned 10, and someone had stolen the bicycle his parents had given him for his birthday. Gravano spotted two older boys with his bike across the street from the saloon. He ran over and tried to slug it out with both of them. A mafioso stepped in and gave Sammy his bike back.
And as the mafioso walks back across the street, he yells to the other guys hanging out there, "Do you see this little Sammy? He's like a little bull." And that's how he got the name, Sammy the Bull.
While Gravano earned the admiration of mobsters, he was not winning compliments from his school teachers. At Shallow Junior High, he was held back twice. Sammy's parents were told their son was a slow learner. He was, in fact, dyslexic.
He started beating up some of the boys in the class who had been mocking him. And as he said, they stopped all the laughing. He said, "That was the first time I found out violence paid."
One day when he was about 13 years old, Sammy got drunk and ended up in the principal's office. As the principal was lecturing him, Sammy stood up and punched the man, breaking his jaw. Gravano was expelled and eventually ended up in a school for juvenile delinquents. Sammy would occasionally lend a hand at his parents' dress factory. It was there he got another look at the mafia. Two union thugs appeared one day and tried to extort his father for using non-union labor. They vowed to return the next week to collect. Sammy got a hold of a gun and was ready to use it to protect his father. But when the two thugs showed up again, Sammy's father wielded a more powerful weapon.
His father mentioned the name of a guy he knew from the old country, a gangster named Spilotro. And all of a sudden, the two guys changed their tune immediately. They knew right away that Sammy's old man was not a guy to fool around with because he knew somebody in the mob. At that point, Sammy realized the power that gangsters had.
Sammy's father had shown he was not above calling on that power himself, but he tried to keep his son from choosing the life of a gangster. He had struggled to provide a comfortable lifestyle for his family. There was a car and even a Long Island summer cottage. But Sammy saw a shortcut to wealth and acceptance.
Sammy Gravano, growing up, looked at his father and said, "That looks too hard. You know, I'm looking around, I'm seeing the American dreams, I'm seeing big cars and wads of money and people who don't really seem to have to work for it. I want to be one of those guys.
By the time he was 16, he had dropped out of school and was committing burglaries and stealing cars with a Bensonhurst street gang known as the Rampers. Sammy and his friends in the gang took an oath. They would stick together forever. But Gravano was forced to leave his gang behind in 1964. He was drafted into the Army and sent off to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic training. Sammy was small, just 5 feet 5 inches, but he made up for it in toughness. To his surprise, the 19-year-old grew to like being a soldier, the rules and traditions, the hierarchy. Gravano attained the rank of corporal, just as the war in Vietnam was heating up.
He said he wouldn't mind staying in the Army and going to Vietnam. He said they gave medals to you for killing people.
But Sammy was never sent overseas, and when his 2-year hitch was over, he left the Army, returned to Bensonhurst, and fell back in with the Rampers. In 1968, a fellow gang member introduced the Bull to his uncle, Tommy Shorty Spiro. Shorty was an associate in New York's Colombo crime family. He recruited Sammy into his crew of burglars. Gravano was 25 when Shorty ordered him to kill another crew member named Joseph Colucci. It was his first murder assignment. The reason behind the killing had to do with Colucci's wife. Shorty's nephew was having an affair with her and wanted to marry her. For Sammy, the reason hardly mattered, nor that Colucci was a friend of his. Carrying out the first hit, what mobsters call making your bones, was a vital step in becoming a member or made guy in the mafia.
He believed in the Cosa Nostra principles. And the principles are, when the boss tells you somebody has to go, he goes.
Colucci was riding in the front seat of a '64 Riviera on February 28, 1970, after a night of club hopping. Sammy the Bull sat right behind him. Gravano pulled out a .32 caliber pistol and shot Colucci twice in the back of the head.
He said he felt like he could feel the bullet leaving the gun, and to take a man's life didn't repel him. It gave him a sense of importance and power that he was now in a position where, sanctioned by some secret society, he could be the instrument that caused someone to live or die.
Jackie Colucci learned of her brother's death the next morning.
Sammy and all the crowd, all the boys came in and started crying and hugging us and saying, "We're going to find out who did this to Joey. Don't worry. You know, we'll find out what happened."
Sammy had made his bones and was on his way to becoming a made guy. His stock in the Colombo crime family soared. That is, until he started feuding with Shorty's brother. Shorty settled the matter by arranging for the Bull to get a mafia transfer. He left the Colombo family and joined another one, the Gambinos, then the most powerful in New York City. By now, Gravano had started a family of his own. When Sammy met 17-year-old Deborah Shibetta, her innocence caught his attention. They married less than a year later, in April 1971. Sammy would later say they were like wolves who mate and stay together for good. Deborah understood the world she was entering, and Uncle was a mob captain.
She was strong-minded. She was not flashy. She was good-looking. And she loved Sammy, and Sammy loved her.
The couple had a daughter, Karen, and later a son, Gerard. The biggest day of Sammy's life, however, was neither his wedding nor the birth of his children. It came in 1976, when Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano inducted Sammy the Bull Gravano into La Cosa Nostra. Castellano kissed the 31-year-old gangster on both cheeks. He decreed, "I am the boss. I am the father of the family. I am your God." In less than a decade, Sammy would betray that oath joining a plot to murder the father of the family. A plot masterminded by a man to whose fate Gravano would forever be linked, John Gotti.
I became a made member of the Gambino family in 1976. At that time, Paul Castellano was the boss of the Gambino family. John Gotti, I, along with some others, murdered Paul Castellano. We took over the family.
Sammy the Bull Gravano met the man who would one day become his crime boss, John Gotti, at an after-hours club in Bensonhurst in 1978. The two gangsters were complete opposites. Gotti was flashy and loved the New York nightlife. Gravano was low-key and enjoyed playing chess, a game perfectly suited to his competitive nature and his obsession with rules and hierarchy. The two men sized each other up.
Each of them knew of the other, each of them had a reputation in their own neighborhoods, and each of them filed away the introduction. And it was kind of a mutual admiration society for a long time between John Gotti and Sammy Gravano.
Gotti was an unofficial mob captain, busy hijacking cargo at JFK Airport. Sammy was just making his mark in a racket that required more intelligence, one that would make him a rich man. Construction. Gravano had started by taking over a drywall company and opening a plumbing company. When boss Paul Castellano had water pressure problems at his Staten Island mansion, Sammy did the boss a favor and sent his workers over to fix it. Sammy impressed Castellano. They began meeting one-on-one. The Bull saw in his crime boss a fellow businessman, someone who could help him get to the top.
Castellano, in Sammy's view, was the best thing since sliced bread. An intelligent, smart guy. Sammy would go and see him, and he'd be sitting there in his silk gown reading the Wall Street Journal.
Big Paul and the Gambino family controlled several labor unions in the construction business. If a contractor wanted to avoid work slowdowns or use cheaper non-union labor, he had to do business with companies owned or controlled by the mob. In return for a sizable chunk of the profits, the mob boss gave Sammy his blessing and put the unions behind him. By the early 1980s, Gravano was flourishing.
We had like 2 companies in the beginning, and then as time went on, there were 2 or 3, 4 companies added on. That, you know, it was that's when I started saying to myself, this guy's opening up a lot of different companies here. You know, something must be expanding his horizons.
Gravano was known as a shrewd businessman who did good work. But people who called on Sammy's influence and went into business with him sometimes found they got more than they bargained for.
What they probably didn't all count on was that over time, Gravano would be more than lending a hand, that he would be taking over their business and that they would be out, and in some cases later they would be dead. But that is the way the world of organized crime works. It is all about the threat of force, then the use of force, and ultimately murder to achieve one goal, which is to make money.
The Bull was not only earning a reputation as a big money maker for the Gambino crime family, the boss knew he could also count on Sammy as a killer. In 1980, boss Castellano ordered the murder of a Philadelphia capo named Johnny Keys Simone. This time, Gravano was not the trigger man. Sammy formed his own crews now to carry out mob executions that he planned.
He says, you don't have to be a genius to pull the trigger. That's the easiest part of a hit. It's setting it up. It's making sure it's done.
In his rise up the mafia ladder, Sammy would not let anyone stand in his way, not even members of his own family. Sammy's brother-in-law, Nick Schibetta, was a low-level crime associate whose cocaine and alcohol problems, along with his homosexuality, had become an embarrassment in the underworld. There were fears he might become an informant. Gravano asked the boss for permission to kill his brother-in-law. Big Paul approved the hit. Gravano's crew murdered Schibetta, and in a sign of disrespect, carved him into pieces. A hand was discovered and buried in a coffin. Sammy comforted his wife during her brother's funeral in 1981. Deborah Gravano had no idea her husband was behind Nick's murder.
Here's a man that went to bed with a woman every night of his married life, knowing that he murdered our brother. Not a lot of men can say that.
Like other gangsters, Gravano had an ability to separate his mob world from his family life when he returned to his Staten Island home every evening.
He had to work hard to bring those kids up. And it is ironic that you can paint the picture of a Fred McMurray home life, the wife, the kids, the loving family, and then you go out every day and you decide who to murder.
Sammy spent weekends with his family at a 30-acre estate in rural New Jersey that he had acquired from a building contractor who owed him money. There was a horse-breeding farm and a racetrack. After years of robbing, stealing, and killing, Gravano finally had a home to rival his boss's mansion. He had made it. With his success, however, came growing resentment at Paul Castellano. Like other gangsters in the crime family, Sammy felt that Castellano, who had become boss through his family connection to his predecessor, Carlo Gambino, had never paid his dues on the street. Such pretensions could be tolerated, but not Big Paul's ravenous appetite for the crime family's earnings. Castellano was already taking a big slice of Sammy's and every other gangster's earnings, but the boss was going too far. In 1984, he formed a construction company and made the head of the rival Genovese crime family, Vincent the Chin Gigante, his partner. Gravano and the rest of the Gambino soldiers were left out of most of the contracts. Big Paul even allowed Gigante to murder a Gambino captain. In Sammy's eyes, this was unforgivable, a transgression against the code of the underworld.
We have a code, an oath, an honor. And I think over time he found there's no real code. The oath is broken immediately, from the first day, by everyone. And there's no real honor.
The resentment against the boss was transforming into a rebellion, led by a man Sammy had met 7 years earlier in a Brooklyn bar, John Gotti. In 1985, Gotti plotted to kill the crime boss. He wanted the bull with him. Gravano hesitated before giving an answer. Castellano was the father of the family. He had groomed Sammy. But John Gotti offered something Paul Castellano never would: power within the crime family. And power meant the opportunity to make even more money. Gravano's pragmatism overcame his sense of loyalty.
Every time he saw an opportunity, particularly in business, if that meant killing somebody, he killed somebody. If it meant taking over somebody's business, a bar or a restaurant, he took it over. He saw another opportunity for Sammy Gravano, and he took it.
On December 16th, 1985, 4 shooters waited for Paul Castellano to arrive at Spark Steakhouse on 2nd Avenue and 46th Street in Manhattan. Just a block away, Sammy Gravano sat next to John Gotti in a parked Lincoln. If the shooters somehow failed, the bull was ready with a .357 Magnum to finish the job.
There was a bond of trust that started that night, which is, we're knee-deep in this thing, and if this thing backfires, we're both dead.
Castellano and his driver, Tommy Bellotti, pulled in front of Sparks at 5 o'clock. Seconds later, gunshots erupted. Gotti and Gravano cruised past the restaurant, where Bellotti and Castellano lay in pools of blood. Gotti was now head of the Gambinos. He made Gravano a captain. As the two men celebrated a new era in the Gambino crime family, Sammy had no idea how quickly it would crumble, nor that he would become the instrument of its demise.
As a member of our family's administration, I helped John Gotti run the family. My primary responsibility was controlling the construction industry in New York. I did this by working...
Sammy the Bull Gravano was a mere soldier in the Gambino crime family when he helped arrange the murder of boss Big Paul Castellano in December 1985. Just 5 months later, the 41-year-old would get his first taste of underworld leadership. In May 1986, the new boss, John Gotti, turned himself in to face federal racketeering charges. Gotti looked for the best man on the street to lead the Gambinos in his absence. He chose Gravano. Gotti knew he could count on the Bull to keep the family in line while he called the shots from his Manhattan jail cell. One of Gotti's first steps was to order Sammy to murder a Gambino soldier named Robert D.B. DiBernardo for talking behind the boss's back. Gravano murdered DiBernardo at the Bull's Bensonhurst office on Stillwell Avenue. D.B. had overseen the Teamsters Union local that delivered materials to building job sites. It was a key to the Gambino's construction rackets, and now Sammy controlled it.
Killing in Gravano's eyes was part of policing the mob to make sure that these people towed the line, said the right things, and didn't violate the rules. That's what he said. But from the greed standpoint, every time Gravano killed someone for one of these infractions, he got that much richer.
Gravano did more than kill for his new boss. He got him out of jail. The Bull had discovered the jury foreman could be bribed for $120,000. Sammy haggled him down to $60,000. Gotti was acquitted. Gravano had impressed Gotti so much that a year later, in 1988, he made Sammy his number 3 man, or consigliere. Since Gotti didn't know much about the construction rackets, he entrusted Sammy to handle them. The Bull had an unnerving presence that helped him enforce the Gambino family's interests.
He had these eyes that I always call them like wolf's eyes, where they could turn on you. And a big part of his role is intimidation and extortion to make all these companies play ball, and Sammy was very good at that.
Among the victims of Gravano's wrath was a member of his own crew, Michael DeBat. When DeBat got hooked on cocaine, Sammy decided he could no longer be trusted. One of the Bull's crew members put 6 bullets in DeBat's head and neck. Gravano told DeBat's sister, Roseanne Massa, who had once been his secretary, that he had nothing to do with the murder.
Sammy came to my brother's wake and gave us $500. That should have comforted us. And we took that $500, burnt it up in the ashtray, and told my brother to rest in peace.
Sammy's ruthlessness was taking him to the pinnacle of the Gambino family. A squad of FBI agents was now paying close attention to Gravano, something the Bull was tipped off about by the teenagers he played handball with near his Bensonhurst office. By now, Sammy's family had moved to this more upscale Staten Island home. Agents knew Gravano rarely strayed from his morning routine. By 7:30, he was on his way to Gleason's gym in Brooklyn. Teddy Atlas, who had once honed the skills of a Brooklyn teenager named Mike Tyson, trained his fighters there. Atlas occasionally worked out with Gravano and put him through his paces.
He heard me say that most important thing a fighter has to do is control his fear. He was surprised. He said, fighters have fear? I said, everyone has fear. He said, well, I don't. And I do remember making a conscious thought to myself, he's lying.
Atlas sent his professional fighters to a hypnotist to reinforce their training. Sammy asked for an appointment.
He told me he was a white-collar worker. He wanted to take off weight. He actually said he wanted to stop eating cake and candy and ice cream. I would talk to him about how he was going to be the better boxer.
Trainer Atlas claims Sammy tried getting an edge another way: steroids. Atlas concluded Gravano was not in the gym simply for a good workout.
I felt that he was doing the boxing and doing the steroids to give himself confidence that he couldn't find himself, to build himself up, to bulk himself up, not physically only, but mentally, to face certain things, to be less afraid.
Gravano's boss had given him reason to be anxious. John Gotti had begun holding court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, which was just a few minutes from FBI headquarters. Gotti made his top leaders check in every afternoon.
John Gotti would show up there with his $2,000 suit and his $200 tie and his entourage and his luxury car. Sammy'd show up in his work clothes or blue jeans. Into the night, say 8:30, 9 o'clock, Gotti would leave with his entourage to go out partying. Sammy would leave there and he'd go home and spend the night with his family.
Gravano tried to warn his crime boss that the Ravenite was no place for the mob to conduct business. The media and even the public were showing up. Gotti didn't listen. Instead, he basked in the attention while his consigliere fumed.
He knew that that light for John Gotti was like a moth to a flame, that you could circle it and bask in it for only so long before you got burned and killed.
Sammy's anxieties were warranted. In November 1989, the FBI had planted a bug in an apartment above the Ravenite where John Gotti held his most private conversations. Agents were steadily building a murder and racketeering case against the Gambino family's upper echelon. In January 1990, the FBI overheard Gotti give a big promotion to the Bull.
You want to stay with me here? Or you want me to make you official underboss, acting boss? How do you feel? What makes you feel better?
Gravano became official underboss of the Gambino crime family. But with the FBI watching the family's every move, the Bull could hardly enjoy his new position. He feared he was about to be indicted.
He just came in a gym where we trained one day and he said, imagine that the U.S. government's going to be coming after me. They conquer countries, they start wars, and they're coming after little old him. That could make you shake in your boots.
If he wound up in prison, Sammy worried about his teenage son, Gerard. While John Gotti had made his son a mafia captain, Sammy did not want his boy anywhere near the underworld.
He had asked me, would I take care of the kid? Would I train him? I understood that that meant that he was concerned about the kid.
Atlas would keep his word when Sammy's fears of going to jail became a reality. On December 11th, 1990, the FBI arrested Gravano, Gotti, and consigliere Frank Locascio. They were locked up in the Metropolitan Correctional Center. It was there that Gravano would make the most important decision of his life, turning his back on La Cosa Nostra and testifying against his boss, John Gotti.
I began to cooperate with the government in 1991. I decided to cooperate before we, meaning me, John Gotti, and our acting consigliere, Frank Locascio, went to trial.
The moment of truth for Sammy the Bull Gravano and his crime boss, John Gotti, came on December 21st, 1990. The two mobsters were in court, along with co-defendant Frank Locascio for a bail hearing. They had been accused of murder and racketeering. Prosecutors played undercover tapes the FBI had recorded in Gotti's headquarters in Little Italy. Gravano had been passing along over $1 million a year to his boss, but Gotti was heard complaining that the Bull was getting greedy.
Every time I turn around, it's a little coffee pot. Weed pockets, food, consulting, concrete.
Gravano listened as Gotti admitted to approving several murders, including that of Robert D.B. DiBernardo, and blamed Sammy for instigating those murders. In all, John Gotti had pinned 3 murders on his underboss.
For one of the few times in life, John Gotti was actually embarrassed. He wanted to dive under the table. Sammy turned white and then red. He was just furious.
The judge denied bail. Sammy, his boss, and Frank Locascio were each locked up in separate jail cells in the isolation unit of New York's Metropolitan Correctional Center. Sammy, a creature of habit who rarely strayed from his daily routine, was back in jail for the first time in 17 years.
Unlike Gotti, he had never really done a stretch of, 2 years here or 5 years there. I think jail was strange and frightening to him.
Locked in his cell 23 hours a day, the bull lay on his cot and brooded over Gotti's betrayal. When they were finally released from the isolation unit after a month, Gotti invited his underboss to a man-to-man discussion.
John basically told Sammy, I was just talking, Sammy, what are you worried about? What's the big deal? And Sammy said, hey, you were talking about me behind my back. That's not the way things are supposed to run.
The bull looked at the pieces on the chessboard and decided that the boss was setting him up as a pawn that could be sacrificed. Sammy was 46 years old, and if convicted, was likely to spend the rest of his life in prison.
I think when he looked at his options then, he said, life in here is not an option, not for any code of honor.
After nearly 10 months in jail, Sammy reached a fateful decision, one that would not only change his life forever, but would turn the New York underworld upside down. Gravano, the second highest ranking member of the most powerful crime family in America, would testify for the government. He would become the thing he had always hated, a rat. Sammy sent a message to the FBI. 2 weeks later, he met secretly with agents and a prosecutor in the jury room of the courthouse about cutting a deal.
This was the underboss of the family, the man who was used to communicate with all the other families, the man who knew all of the other bosses and underbosses and captains. This was the mother lode.
When his wife Deborah and daughter Karen came to visit him in jail, Sammy told them about his deal with the government. Karen, shocked that her father was becoming a snitch, fled the room crying. Deborah stayed behind as her husband explained.
He told her what he was going to do. Testify against Gotti and go into the witness protection program. And she wouldn't do it. She said, I can't put my children through it, and me. I think she said, that part of our life is your life, it's not mine.
Deborah left the jail, and for the time being, left her husband as well. At midnight on November 8th, Sammy also walked out of the jail, leaving John Gotti and the mob behind forever.
John Gotti sent a message to the effect that part of my heart broke when my son was killed. The other part broke when you defected to the government.
The bull was transferred to the FBI's training academy in Quantico, Virginia, where a deal was finalized. Gravano agreed to testify for 2 years in any case the government wanted. The most prison time he could get was 20 years. Back in New York, when word got out that Sammy had become a government witness, flyers were posted all over the city showing Sammy's head on the body of a rat.
There were times where he had pangs about cooperating. He had a lot of guilt for what he was doing, a lot of remorse. And he always had this constant fear of being abandoned by the government.
On March 2nd, 1992, Gravano became the highest-ranking member of La Cosa Nostra ever to testify against his boss. As he settled into his chair, Sammy ignored Gotti's stare. The jury listened as prosecutors led Gravano through a blow-by-blow account of his life in the mob and the murder of Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano.
They believed him. They didn't like him. They didn't like him at all. He's not a likable guy in a lot of ways. Well, in all ways, frankly. But they believed him.
Gotti's attorney, Albert Krieger, cross-examined Gravano. The bull stood his ground.
He was contained, articulate, not responsive as the angry, blustering degenerate I now know him to be.
I was a good, loyal soldier, Sammy announced near the end of his 9-day testimony. John barked, and I bit. On April 2nd, 1992, the jury found Gotti guilty of all murder and racketeering charges.
Gravano's attitude was Gotti tried to betray him, and Sammy took steps to see that that didn't happen. Like it was a chess game. Except Gotti was playing with checkers.
Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without parole at the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Gravano, on the other hand, was about to become a free man. After helping to put his crime boss, John Gotti, in prison for life in 1992, Sammy Gravano spent the next 2 years testifying for the government. He became the most famous mob turncoat since Joe Valachi. Like Valachi, Gravano testified before a U.S. Senate hearing on organized crime. This one focused on the mob's corruption of professional boxing, including its practice of paying off fighters to throw bouts.
And I believe if he would have knocked them out by accident, he would have picked them up.
By the time he finished testifying, Gravano played a role in sending 37 people to prison. They included a juror, a cop, several union officials, 4 crime family bosses, 9 captains, and over 30 mob soldiers.
You never got guilty pleas from these characters before. You point Sammy at them and they give up because they know Sammy knows. Sammy was their boss.
Gravano's own sentencing came on September 26, 1994. The Bull faced up to 20 years in prison. Before sentencing Sammy, Judge Leo Glasser declared, "There has never been a defendant whose impact on organized crime has been so important and so extensive." Judge Glasser sentenced the Bull to 5 years in prison, plus 3 years of supervised release. With time already served, Gravano had less than 7 months left in prison. To Gotti's defense attorney, the sentence was a blot on the justice system.
Gravano is filth to his core. What he has done is he has found a way to bargain for his freedom, and we buy it.
The 37 people who were convicted and in jail because Sammy Gravano testified would be on the street, themselves killing people still, if we didn't reward testimony of accomplice witnesses.
Gravano walked out of a federal prison for government witnesses on April 19, 1995, a free man of sorts. John Gotti had allegedly put a $2 million bounty on his head. He had just turned 50 years old and was about to be reborn in the Witness Protection Program. Before assigning him a new identity, the government did a psychological evaluation of Gravano. The conclusion was hardly reassuring. The likelihood of violent behavior is substantial, the report noted. He continues to be violent despite his age.
Let's say he opened a video store. And, a guy opened a video store across the street from him. And he'd say, hey, it's a small town. Why don't you open a video store somewhere else? In his old life, he'd firebomb the guy's store. If he'd reopened, he'd kill him. Now he can't do that. And the question is, can he adjust? Has he adjusted?
As the Bull tried to start a new life with a new identity, he showed he was anything but predictable. He had always hugged the shadows as a gangster. But rather than sink safely into anonymity, Gravano soon dropped out of witness protection and thrust himself back into the public eye. In a best-selling book written with Peter Maas, and in a television interview with Diane Sawyer. Sammy appeared without a disguise, giving the country a good look at his plastic surgery. Just as his crime boss once had, Gravano now seemed to crave the spotlight. By exposing himself, he inadvertently opened the legal doors to a group of people who were as eager to hunt him down as John Gotti, the relatives of the Bull's 19 murder victims. The book allowed them to file wrongful death claims against Gravano under New York's Son of Sam law. Roseanne Mass's brother Mike DeBatt was one of Sammy's victims, most of whom were associated in some way with the mob.
Nobody's proclaiming anybody to be an altar boy, but before these men sold their souls, they were somebody's father, somebody's brother, somebody's son, and their lives had meaning to people.
It's good for Sammy Gravano to know that he can't entirely wrap himself up in the American flag, because out there are people who, under color of law, are seeking to recover the money that he's made from the murders that he committed.
When Gravano returned to the stand in 1997 to testify against Genevieve's crime boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante, the families of the Bulls murder victims converged on the courthouse.
What's Gravano doing here? Selling more books.
During cross-examination, Gigante's defense attorney forced Gravano to admit that he hoped to make nearly $1.5 million from his book and a related movie deal. Gigante was convicted. The wrongful death suits are still pending.
So many lives were touched by the actions of this one man. That this one man, look what he's done to his own family. I think about his son and his daughter. You imagine the weight of the world on his son's shoulders? I think about this kid. His daughter. What happens the day she gets married? Sammy gonna walk her down the aisle?
Deborah Gravano sold their Staten Island home and moved to another state with daughter Karen and son Gerard. She and Sammy have divorced, though he occasionally calls to check up on their children. Deborah now knows for certain that Sammy was responsible for killing her brother.
He said the thought of putting his loyalty to Cosa Nostra above his loyalty to his wife and his children was something he was going to have to live with for the rest of his life.
Since Gravano is no longer in the witness protection program, he must fend for himself against those who would like to see him dead. Of course, many of those people are now behind bars. But there's always a young Turk looking to become a made man, just as Sammy once did.
He said he couldn't discount the thought that some kid would try to make a name for himself by taking him out. And he looked away in the distance as if he were seeing this kid approaching. He looked back at me and said, "Boy, he better be good."
The Bull has once again disappeared into the shadows.
The thing that makes him unique is that he turned at the top of his game and helped bring down 30 to 40 guys in and around the Gambino crime family.
It amazes me how many different hats this man wore. He wore the hat of a businessman, of a father, of a husband, of a murderer, of an extortionist.
He's trying to go on with his life. You know, he's had to step over a few bodies to do it, but I think he's trying to go on with his life.
He's just a regular old rat. He's the kind of guy who is in it for Sammy Gravano, and he has no loyalty to anyone except Sammy Gravano.